Have you ever felt powerless? Powerless before men who wear fine coats and speak of order while they grind your spirit into the mud? In Hollow Creek they called it peace. But peace came with chains. The British banners fluttered over the churchyard, red and bright, symbols of authority built on tears. Poor farmers bent their backs to pay taxes that fed officers' feasts. Children watched their bread taken by laughing soldiers. Women bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in shame. They said, "We were subjects, but we were patriots. We were people of faith, of land, of dignity." Father Nathaniel Cross preached forgiveness. He believed in mercy, even when mercy starved. And Mary Whitlow, heavy with child, walked through those empty streets as if carrying the last light left in the world. Betrayal had become law. Humiliation, our daily bread. But somewhere, deep beneath the silence, the pulse of freedom began to rise. Stay with me until the end, for this is where peace ends, and struggle begins. Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed. Give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story. Lieutenant Edward Clark walked through Hollow Creek as if he owned its very air. His boots struck the cobblestones like hammers of judgment, his gloved hands resting easily on the hilt of his sword. Wherever he passed, doors closed, curtains trembled. Mothers pulled their children inside. Old men looked down, swallowing their anger like poison. He enjoyed that silence, the silence of submission. To him, these colonists were insects pretending to be men, and every act of cruelty was a lesson in obedience. That evening, the church bell tolled for Mass. Clark entered uninvited, dragging mud across the wooden floor. The villagers rose as he passed, not out of respect, but out of fear. His laughter echoed through the sacred hall as he tossed a silver coin toward the altar. "For your God," he said, "if he can still feed the hungry." Father Cross stood behind the pulpit, his face pale but unbroken. "One day, Lieutenant," he murmured, "you will beg him for mercy." Clark smirked, drawing close enough for the priest to smell the wine on his breath. "Mercy," he said softly, "is for Englishmen." The insult lingered like smoke. After the sermon, soldiers tore through the market square, demanding food for their garrison. They took flour, pigs, anything their hands could seize. When an old farmer dared to protest, Clark ordered him stripped and whipped before the townsfolk. "Let this be the price of rebellion," he shouted, as the lash cracked. The man's back opened, like parchment under ink. Children wept. Women turned away. The priest knelt beside the fallen man, pressing his stole against the wounds. He prayed, but his hands trembled, not from fear, but from something awakening. That night, Father Cross could not sleep. The words of the lieutenant burned within him. He thought of Mary Whitlow, her child soon to come into a world without compassion. He thought of the men broken by hunger, of the women shamed before their sons. He had preached patience all his life, believing peace was the highest virtue. But now, peace had become a cloak for disgrace. Was it still holy to endure, when endurance meant submission to evil? His prayers became whispers of conflict, his faith a storm with no calm center. Meanwhile, in the tavern across the square, Clark drank and laughed with his officers. "They speak of liberty," he said between gulps, "but they kneeled faster than dogs." The soldiers roared in approval, clanking their mugs. Yet one among them, a young recruit named Thomas Gray, kept silent. He had seen the whipping earlier. The screams still echoed in his ears. Something in the priest's eyes had unsettled him, something like sorrow or warning. That night, Thomas wandered to the edge of town and stared at the dark hills where whispers of rebellion were said to stir. He wondered how long men could be treated as beasts before they became wolves. The next morning brought news that chilled even the coldest hearts. A child had died, the baker's son, starved. The soldiers had taken their last loaf 2 nights before. When Mary Whitlow learned of it, she fell to her knees, clutching her belly. "What kind of world will he be born into?" she cried. The priest stood helpless. The church, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. From the pulpit where he once preached peace, he now saw despair reflected in every face. The words of Scripture rang hollow against the sound of empty stomachs and quiet sobs. And then came the breaking point. During the noon inspection, Lieutenant Clark ordered the villagers to kneel as the flag of England was raised over the church. One man refused, Ellis Boone, a crippled veteran of the frontier wars. "I fought for this land," he said, voice trembling but proud. "No tyrant will make me bow." Clark's face twisted with delight. "Then stand, Patriot," he said mockingly, drawing his pistol. The shot echoed through the valley. Elias fell. The flag waved above his body, red as blood. The people froze. The priest's voice broke the silence. "You've killed honor itself," he said. Clark turned his pistol toward him. "Then let your God raise it again." But he didn't shoot. Not yet. He enjoyed the fear more than the kill. "Remember this, priest," he said, stepping closer. "Your prayers will not save you. Only obedience will." He left the church laughing, unaware that the sound of his laughter had already become the drumbeat of rebellion. That night, as the wind howled over the town, Father Cross climbed the bell tower. Below him, Hollow Creek slept in misery. The air smelled of smoke and despair. Yet somewhere in that darkness he felt a presence, a spark that refused to die. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was something older, something born not from heaven but from the soil itself. He looked toward the hills, where faint lights flickered, signals, maybe, from those who still dared to dream of independence. He whispered a prayer, not for peace, but for courage, for transformation, for revelation. The time for sermons had ended. The time for decisions had come. Far below, in the square where Elias Boone had fallen, a child placed a wildflower on the blood-stained earth. It trembled in the cold wind, but did not fall. Neither did Father Cross. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence, to the sorrow, to the heartbeat of a people about to awaken. The night carried an answer, distant but certain. The journey toward freedom had begun, and there would be no turning back. Comet, the flame of freedom lives in me. Rain blurred the torches into halos as Mary Whitlow stood in the square, mud clinging to her ankles, hands bound with rough rope that bit her wrists. The 3 militiamen she had fed were slumped against the stocks, their faces gray with pain. Boys, really. One mumbled a prayer through cracked lips. Another stared at the church door as if it might open and swallow him into safety. The storm drummed on rooftops and helmets. Hollow Creek held its breath. Clark arrived. Under a black cloak, hat pulled low, boots bright with grease, his officers formed a wall of scarlet around him, wealth and rank standing shoulder to shoulder, armored in contempt. He looked at Mary's belly and smiled as if he'd solved a riddle. "You feed the king's enemies," he said, savoring each word, "and call it mercy." He tipped his chin toward the prisoners. "This is not compassion. This is sedition. You are the womb of rebellion." A murmur ran through the crowd. Women clenched their shawls. Old men shifted their weight, shame and fury twisting in their throats. Father Cross stepped forward, rain plastering his hair to his brow. "She saved lives," he said. "That is not a crime under any heaven." Clark's pale eyes flicked to him. "This is not heaven, priest," he replied. "This is the empire." They hauled a barrel into the square and made a desk of it. A crude tribunal. The merchants of Hollow Creek, those who dined with officers and spoke French to sound refined, took places. As witnesses, they nodded, grateful for the attention of power. They recited what Clark wished to hear. Bread given, bandages tied, secrets whispered. Their lies wore velvet. Their betrayal smelled like perfume. Mary lifted her chin. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "I fed hungry men," she said. "One had the fever. Another's leg was torn. I did what any mother would do." Clark laughed softly. "A mother protects her child. You invited death to your door." He gestured toward the militiamen. "These thieves deliver insurrection. They would turn simple peasants into mobs. They would tear down a flag older than your memories." His words dripped disdain. "They promise independence, then lead you to graves." Lightning veined the sky. The 3 prisoners tried to stand straighter. The tallest boy met Mary's eyes and blinked gratitude he could not speak. Father Cross saw it, and felt the old life inside him the life that still believed patience could pacify wolves. In that instant he understood a hidden truth. Mercy has a spine. Charity without resolve is only permission for cruelty. The realization struck like iron against flint. A spark. A decision. Clark outlined the sentence. Fines for treason. Public shaming for harboring fugitives. Stocks for the militiamen at dawn, and a lashing at noon. For Mary, a punishment meant to degrade more deeply than rope or steel. He ordered her to kneel before the flag and beg the crown to forgive her rebellious womb. Gasps knifed the air. Even some soldiers shifted uneasily. She did not kneel. The storm fell silent for a heartbeat, as if creation waited. Mary placed a hand on her belly and spoke to the child and to the town and to the centuries ahead. "I will not bow to wickedness," she said. "My child will know that dignity does not crawl." The square vibrated with that word. Dignity. A fragile blade, suddenly sharp. Clark's smile thinned. "Kneel," he repeated, "or I make an example." He signaled, and two soldiers seized her shoulders. The baby kicked. She clenched her jaw. Father Cross stepped forward. "You will not touch her again." Clark raised a hand and the soldiers froze, surprised by the steadiness in the priest's voice. Cross's eyes were no longer gentle. They held a different light, something ancestral, something forged in the wilderness. "You call domination peace," he said, "but what you name peace is only silence after a whipping." Clark weighed the crowd. He saw men swallow vengeance, women hide tears, children stare like witnesses to a funeral. He saw an ember glowing under wet ash. He decided to stamp it out. "Very well," he said. "If she will not plead, then let the town suffer for her sin." He turned to the merchants. "Quarter the troops in the homes of those who cheered her. Double the levies. Take every stored sack. If a barn hides grain, burn it. If a child hides bread, take the mother's coat." The merchants bowed, eager, obedient. They had made their choice to profit from the degradation of their neighbors. Collaboration as currency. The storm broke again. Torches hissed. The tribunal ended with a flourish of paper and a smear of sealing wax. Soldiers dragged the militiamen away. The square bled footprints. Mary stood where she was, trembling, then found her balance and walked toward the church. No one stopped her. Men turned their faces from Clark to her and felt a revelation. Survival without honor is not life. The air changed, not with shouts, with resolve. Inside the nave, candlelight wavered. Cross wrapped Mary in a blanket and rested his hands over hers. "This is a long journey," he said softly, "and the road asks for sacrifice." She nodded. "Then we pay what is ours to pay," she replied. Somewhere behind them, a door creaked. Thomas Gray, the young soldier, hovered in the threshold, eyes haunted by what he had seen. He set a small bundle on the floor. Bread. A strip of clean linen. He did not speak. He simply looked at the priest, then at Mary, and left the church as quietly as a confession. The bells did not ring. The town did not riot. Yet something moved, like roots under the frost. Fathers traded glances that were more than glances. Mothers sewed at candlelight and stitched whispers into seams. Boys learned to listen for hoofbeats. Girls learned where to hide a message. The market learned to weigh prices in courage. The tavern learned to pour secrets alongside ale. A transformation gathered, patient as winter. Night, inevitable as dawn. Clark slept easily that evening, feeling master of all he surveyed. He feared rifles and barricades. He did not fear candles, or lullabies, or the way a priest's voice could harden into iron. He did not fear the moment when townspeople stopped asking permission to breathe. He did not fear the quiet, where liberty often begins, deep, hidden, unstoppable. Mary lay awake, hand on her belly, hearing rain and distant boots, and somewhere beyond both, the low thunder of people finding their will. Freedom would not arrive with fanfare. It would arrive with choices, with small betrayals of fear, with revelations whispered over cradles, with a priest who took off his stole and tied it like a band around his wrist. The square waited. The gallows beam groaned in the wind. The flag snapped, arrogant as ever. And beneath that cloth, in the hush before dawn, Hollow Creek gathered the last pieces of its courage and fashioned them into a single, steady breath. The torch flared and the smell of pitch rose like a lie. The cross stood crooked before the church, altar turned scaffold. Men in scarlet circled like carrion. The crowd pressed close, mouths open, eyes hollow with the weight of what they were asked to witness. Father Cross lunged forward and a soldier's bayonet pinned him back. The priest fell to his knees, rain and blood and holy water mixing on his face. "She carries life," he pleaded, voice breaking with a prayer. "Have mercy." Clark's glove struck him like a verdict. "Mercy ends where the crown begins," he said, cold as winter. They forced Mary's wrists to the timber. The iron bite of nails, the rasp of rope. Her scream was not a sound of agony. It was a hymn. "Forgive them, Father," she cried, and even the rain seemed to shiver at that forgiveness. The town watched disgrace made public. Shame was draped over mothers like a cloak. Children buried their faces. Old men gripped walking sticks until knuckles shone white. The officers smirked. Nobles counted their advantages. Merchants smiled thinly, already calculating profit from the ashes. Clark crouched, savoring the spectacle. A general performing justice. He signaled the torch. Flame kissed dry wood. The cross became a small sun. Mary's face glowed, unbroken. Her lips moved in prayer. She did not plead for herself. She named the unborn. She named a promise. The fire took the burlap and rose. Smoke curled into the rafters like a snake. And then a sound split the night as single. Sharp report from the far edge of town. A musket fired into the dark. Men and soldiers flinched. Horses neighed. A boy screamed. In the doorway of the rectory, Thomas Gray stood with his hand trembling on a rifle. His uniform hung too large on his shoulders. He had sworn allegiance to a crown that taught him contempt. Now his oath split like brittle glass. He did not aim to kill a man. He aimed to break a ritual. The shot shredded the quiet. It struck the barrel near Clark's foot. Splinters flew, the torch toppled, panic tasted like rain. Soldiers lunged, merchants squeezed into doorways. The crowd surged, not in flight but in motion, as if a buried thing had found a voice. Fathers dragged children away. Mothers snatched cloaks and rolled them into sacks. Men who had bowed an hour ago squared their shoulders. The whip of humiliation had become a branding iron. Now it burned in anger. Thomas dropped the rifle and ran toward the alley where the wounded militiaman lay. He knelt beside them, then rose and crossed himself in a gesture that looked like atonement. Father Cross, blood on his cheek, climbed to the steps and lifted his voice. It was not the soft sermon of peace. It was a bell of steel. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of a life not measured by obedience, but by the will to refuse contempt. In the chant of his words, the hidden truth uncoiled. Mercy without courage breeds only further degradation. That revelation settled like iron in the town's bones. Men gathered in corners and whispered decisions. The baker who had once handed bread to soldiers placed a loaf behind a loose stone. The widow who mended shirts slipped needles into pockets with notes tied to them. Boys learned routes and took messages along hedgerows. The market keeper who had sold favors to officers now wrote names on a folded scrap and slid it beneath a stall. Each small act was a stone in a road being built. Clark barked orders. He did not understand the geometry of stubbornness. He thought force could cut down determination as one shears wheat. He sent patrols to the hills and set extra guards at the church. He punished a farmer for hiding grain and a woman for whispering with a lash that left stinging maps across skin. Yet every punishment unearthed more resolve. Rebellion does not always rise with banners and drums. Sometimes it fosters in ashes, in whispered plans, in the quiet that follows outrage. It grows in places where people trade fear for choice. That night, in a barn lit by a single lantern, men sharpened tools and traded stories of past wrongs. They argued, not about hatred, but about what must be saved: land, children, the right to sit at a table without being looked through. They swore to defend the dignity that had been stolen. Some pledged to stay and fight. Others chose to move, to carry secrets to neighboring towns, to weave a network that could not be smothered by bayonets. Each decision was a sacrifice. Each plan, a fragment of a larger journey toward liberty. Mary's voice echoed in the minds of those who had heard her. "My child will know that dignity does not crawl." The phrase passed from lip to lip until it became a creed. The priest wrapped a strip of his stole around his wrist and handed the rest to a young militiaman, who wore it like an unspoken vow. A hidden map of allies began to form. Revelations surfaced, not of spies and generals, but of ordinary courage waiting for a cause. Dawn found Hollow Creek raw, and quiet smoke still braided the sky. The flag waved as if nothing had changed. Yet beneath the surface, a transformation had begun. The townsfolk moved with purpose now, each small rebellion a stitch in a wider fabric. Betrayal had been exposed. Those merchants who had sold their neighbors for pennies. Those officers who mistook cruelty for authority. Their choices lay bare, and the people's choice stood in starker relief: endure more degradation, or take the difficult road toward independence. The road would demand blood and loss. It would test faith and loyalty. It would reveal treacheries and hidden truths no one wanted named. But a march had begun, quiet, stubborn, inevitable. The town inhaled and prepared to step forward. Rain hissed on the burning cross, turning smoke into a bitter shroud that pressed against faces and throats. The fire had already taken what it wanted. What remained was a stain on the night and a wound in the town. Redcoats clinked pewter cups beneath doorways. Rum brightened their mouths, jokes brighter still. The merchants hovered at the edges of the glow, counting favors, counting coins, counting how much loyalty might buy them when the world finally measured their worth. Children did not cry. They had stepped past tears into a silence that was older than grief. Father Cross stayed kneeling in the mud until his knees forgot they were knees. The flames wrote their verdict on his eyes. Not a sentence from heaven, a sentence from men. He had asked for providence and received a pyre. That knowledge did not crush him. It forged him. He rose slowly, as if lifting the weight of every promise he had ever made from the floor. When he wiped his face, the gesture felt like shedding skin. He looked not at the soldiers, not at Clark, not at the nobles with their polished boots, but at his people, farmers with cracked hands, wives who hid their strength in shawls, old fighters with woods in their bones. This ends, he said, almost to himself. The words did not shout. They settled. They found homes in chests. Thomas Gray stepped out of an alley, raindrops threading his hair, his uniform suddenly obscene on his shoulders. He stopped at the priest's side and bowed his head. "I can unlock the armory," he whispered. Not bravado, a choice. Cross studied him without blessing or curse. "Then you have begun your penance," he answered. "Penance is a road, not a single step." The boy nodded. He seemed smaller in that moment, and then steadier. Betrayal moved both ways tonight, against the crown and against the cowardice that had held decent men hostage. The town dispersed in currents. Doors closed without slamming. Windows shuttered without panic. Beneath the quiet, life reorganized. A loom of decision stretched from kitchen to barn to chapel. In one house, a mother unwound her wedding ribbon and stitched it into a pouch that would carry cartridges. In another, an old hunter oiled a musket that had slept under straw since the frontier days, and marked sight lines from attic to lane. A girl, no more than 12, lifted the floorboard where her father hid tools and found a flint. She struck it once. The spark died, but the thought remained. Liberty begins where permission ends. Near the tavern, Clark leaned under the eaves, amused by the second baptism of rain and smoke. "You see," he told an officer, "fear is more efficient than famine." He flicked ash from his glove. "Tomorrow we hang the boys and whip the priest. Then the ledger. We'll balance." The officer laughed too loudly. He had seen Cross rise. He had heard something in the townspeople's breathing. Clark did not notice the tremor. The arrogance of noble blood is deaf to weather it cannot name. Through the watches of the night, figures moved like rumors between houses. Cross passed from door to door with a sack on his shoulder and a wet lantern at his hip. He did not ask for rage. He asked for resolve. Flour for the wounded, salt pork for the men in the hills. A wheel of cheese from a widow who had kept it for a winter that would not come now. Every offering cost something. Every exchange carried dignity back across a line the crown had tried to erase. Names were not spoken loudly, but they were remembered. A map took shape on the inside of minds. Before dawn, Thomas led Cross to the garrison storehouse. 2 locks. 1 sentry with a cough that came at regular intervals. The priest's hand brushed the boy's shoulder. Not a blessing, a bond. Thomas lifted the key from its nail with the care of a man removing a thorn from a sleeping lion. The door opened with a sigh that sounded like an old gate remembering daylight. Powder, shot, a crate marked for a fort downriver. Cross did not touch the muskets. He took only what could move without notice. He left the racks leaning as they had stood, like a congregation unaware it had already lost its pastor. When they stepped back onto the lane, the sky had thinned from black to iron. In the square, the cross smoldered like a buried coal. Cross halted there, not to linger in grief, but to measure a vow against the ash. His lips moved. No one heard the words. He was not asking now. He was swearing. At mid-morning, patrols marched. They found houses swept, hearths cold, eyes too calm. Clark ordered searches. Barrels were pried open and scattered to the mud. A grandmother's bread dough was prodded with a bayonet while she watched with a stillness that would outlive the soldier's memory. A young mother's shawl was ripped from her shoulders under pretense of inspection. Humiliation had become a tactic. Disgrace wore a uniform. Yet not a single scream rose to feed their sport. The people's silence had changed. It was no longer the quiet of fear. It was the reserve of strategy. By afternoon, word reached the hills. A circle formed under a stand of pines where men of the militia, aged, stubborn, half-starved, waited for hope they did not trust. Cross arrived with Thomas in a sack he could barely lift. Powder, lead, salt, bandages cut from the priest's own vestments. The men stared at the stole, now strips for binding wounds. "You are no longer just our priest," an old tracker said. "You are our standard." Cross shook his head. "No," he answered. "The standard is a child's name spoken without fear. Plans sharpened, not grand assaults. Nerves of the occupation would be pinched until the hand went numb. Bridges would break under weight at the wrong time. A wagon meant for a distant fort would discover a missing wheel. A ledger would misplace numbers that could not be found. A candle would tip in a merchant store that kept too much loyalty behind its counter. No one spoke of vengeance as triumph. They spoke of reclaiming breath, of keeping their dead from being mocked by the living. Evening drew its line across the town. Clark posted notices on the church door: curfews, levies, a promise that failure would be answered with exemplary correction. The words were neat. The threat was sloppy. Father Cross read the notice and did not tear it down. He pinned another scrap beneath it in a hand that did not shake. "Men are not property. We kneel only to God and to grief." People read it and walked away with their chins a fraction higher. Night deepened. In a loft above the rectory, Cross set a small box on the table. Inside lay a lock of hair tied with twine and a tiny medal that had belonged to a woman who had refused to bend. He closed the lid and set his palm on it, as one would set a stone on a grave. The room was very still, the kind of stillness where a journey changes direction and does not say so aloud. On the ridge, 3 lanterns blinked in answer to one another. Once, twice, and then a long pause, like a held breath before a plunge. The signals matched the plan. The town would not wait for salvation to descend on wings. It would build its own passage through the dark with hands that had plowed and stitched and carried for generations. The path would be cut at cost. It would ask for sacrifice without applause. It would demand that mercy learn to stand. Somewhere beyond the ridge, dogs barked, hooves rattled on stone. A messenger was coming, or a patrol, or both at once. And whatever it was would push Hollow Creek across the threshold it had drawn for itself. The fire had broken heaven. Now the people would decide what to raise from the ash. Right, the flame of freedom lives in me. The bell in the crypt was small and mismatched, but its note carried like a summons. Men and women slipped down stone steps with lanterns held low. The air smelled of earth and old prayers. Faces showed lines the plow had carved and the winters had deepened. Hands bore blisters, burns, calluses. They had been taught to bow. Tonight they would learn to stand. Father Cross stood beneath the arch, his cassock ragged, eyes bright with a new flame. He did not preach in the gentle cadence of the pulpit. He spoke with the bluntness of a man who had seen too much and would see more. "We have suffered humiliation," he said. "We have watched dignity burn. We have been made small by men in fine coats." His voice was a blade. Heads nodded. The word rebellion was not spoken like a sin. It landed like a promise. Elias Boone put his scarred hand on the table. His spine still carried the memory of musket recoil. "I will not be a spectacle," he said. He had seen friends fall for less than a look. He had buried sons without coffins. Rage lived in him, like a second pulse. His refusal to bow had cost him blood. It had also given him a name the boys could call without whispering. Jonathan Pike flexed his fingers where the hammer had shaped them. His brother's hanging still hung in his throat like smoke. He wore loss as a jacket that would not come off. "They took my kin because they were afraid of what he said," Jonathan murmured. "They hanged him to show there is no justice. But justice is not made by rope. It is made by resolve." His eyes found the priest's. The hidden truth in his tone was simple. Anger alone does not win. Plans do. Sarah Whitlow kept her scarf wet at the hem, the smell of soot still clinging to her hair. Mary had been an ember and then a blaze. Sarah's hands trembled when she lifted them, and then steadied. "My sister died in flames," she said, voice small and hard, but she spoke of dignity. She spoke of a child who must grow knowing courage. Her grief had become a map. The town's sorrow had found a route to action. They spoke of small things, routes, codes, signals. A bell struck twice quickly. A cart left the market with a crate that hit a musket barrel. A ledger was altered so that a merchant would be forced to account for goods he had never claimed. They planned to deny the officers comfort and delay their supplies. They would steal nights, not days. They would take what they needed and leave questions behind. Strategy, not spectacle. Each scheme tasted like risk and like possibility. Father Cross revealed a revelation that tightened the room. "There are men among them who will betray us for coin," he said. Faces turned. A ragged cough came from a corner. No betrayal yet, but a smell. "And there are merchants who will pretend to be allies while they sell our names." The admission did not frighten them. It focused them. Betrayal was no longer a distant rumor. It was a force to be met. Thomas Gray knelt by the dark wall. His youth had been cut by ridicule, and then by duty. Now, it cut him for a new reason. "I looked for honor in their ranks," he said. "I found orders. I found cruelty. I will not be part of that shame." He handed over a folded piece of cloth, part of his uniform. Stripped of insignia, and with it went secrets. Guard rotations, the number of muskets, the schedule of patrols. He had risked everything. The currency of his choice was priceless. Decisions were made in tight voices. Men volunteered for watch. Women offered hiding places and food. Boys learned to move like shadows. Old men taught the young how to smell an ambush. Each pledge required sacrifice. Wives would keep quiet while husbands slipped out at night. Children would learn to hide their mouths when soldiers passed. Dignity would be defended on the smallest of battlegrounds. They marked a path of transformation. No grand banners, no false bravado. They would begin by reclaiming what the occupiers had stolen: the right to sleep without fear, the right to bury their dead without mockery, the right to teach their children to hold their heads high. Each recovery would be a lesson. Each reclaimed loaf, a small liberty. Each successful smuggling, a step toward independence. Outside, rain tapped the church roof. The world smelled of wet straw and distant coal smoke. In the hush, the priest folded his hands, not in prayer but in preparation. He did not promise heaven. He promised action. "We do this for the child who will not know the taste of bread taken from his mouth," he said. "We do this for the fathers who will teach their sons to farm and not fear a patrol. We do this so that dignity may breathe again." They left the crypt like a single heartbeat that had learned to beat louder. Lanterns were snuffed. Shadows recombined into homes. The plan unfolded in pockets across the town, an exchange here, a sabotage there. The work would be slow and costly. It would ask for names to be hidden and for loyalty to be sharpened. It would demand sacrifices that would bruise hearts. On the ridge, 3 lights blinked in reply. The code was set. The first moves would be quiet broken hinges, misdelivered letters, a wagon that did not arrive. Each small success would teach them how to dare more. Each mistake would be a lesson, hard and honest. The bell's tongue hammered the morning as the first shots cracked the air. Smoke rolled from the tower slats and drifted over the square like a torn banner. The 2 fallen redcoats lay twisted beneath the steps, their polished buttons catching a light they would not see again. Clark's sneer curdled into fury. "Take the tower," he barked. But the stair was narrow and the climb blind. The first man who rushed it slid back with a cry, blood making the steps slick. On the altar, the musket and Mary's rosary glowed like a verdict. Father Cross stood in the nave's shadow, cassock ragged, eyes cold. He did not lift a weapon. He lifted resolve. From the ridge came a roar no regiment could drill, axes beating on shields, knives flashing at belts, hunting rifles held in hands that had aged on plow handles. Old men who remembered frontier winters. Women who had washed humiliation from their porches and could no longer scrub. Boys whose voices had broken on the word justice. They moved like a tide that knew its shoreline. This was not chaos. It was a plan finally breathing. Clark drew his sword and pointed at the church. "Hold the square," he shouted to his officers. "Break the rabble." Merchants peered from doorways, their faces small with calculation. One slipped toward the garrison gate with a folded note under his coat. Jonathan Pike saw him and understood at once. Betrayal had a gate. He caught the man by the collar and dragged him into the light. The note spilled into the mudguard counts, signal marks, a list of names. Jonathan pressed the paper to the offender's chest, then pinned him to the wall with a hammer's head under his jaw. "Your profit ends here," he said. There was no time for judgment, only for warning. He let the coward crumple and ran toward the clash. Elias Boone fired from the bell and felt the old recoil bloom in the ruined muscles of his back. A ribbon of hot pain, then focus. Below, Sarah Whitlow slid along the church's flank with a bucket of ash and a pouch of salt. Not weapons exactly, tools of denial. She appended ash into a redcoat's eyes and drove her knee into his thigh. Another lunged. She slashed his cheek with a hidden shard of bottle glass. Shame had burned out of her. What remained was a steadiness that could not be taught. The first charge met in the market lane. Militiamen fired twice, then fell to knives and clubs. The redcoats answered with drilled volleys that tore bark from carts and tore breath from lungs. A boy named Matthew fell with a sound like a word swallowed unfinished. Cross reached him under smoke and lifted his head. "You were brave," he whispered, and the boy smiled because he had wanted to be told that once. The priest closed the lids and rose with a face that made even the wind hold still. Sacrifice had a cost. He would spend it wisely. Thomas Gray fought like a man unlearning disgrace. He shot once, broke a stock across a sergeant's wrist, then pulled a wounded farmer behind a trough and tore his own sleeve to bind the leg. A corporal recognized him. "Traitor," the man hissed, thrusting with a bayonet. Thomas caught the blade with a pitchfork tine and twisted metal screeching like a hawk. "No," he answered. "Patriot." The word surprised him with how right it felt. Clark tried to turn the tide with cavalry that Hollow Creek did not have. He sent a handful of mounted men down the main street, sabers high. Jonathan Pike rolled a barrel into their path and fired. The staves burst, spilling iron nails across the cobbles. Hooves skidded. A horse screamed and went down hard. Its rider tumbled into a stall of apples, red fruit bouncing like shot. Panic scrabbled at the edges of discipline. The church bell tolled again, slower now, as if counting decisions. Cross saw a redcoat aim at the tower slit where Elias stood. He stepped between them and felt the ball take the wood beside his ear. Splinters stung his cheek. He did not flinch. He was learning a new liturgy, one written in powder burns and whispered oaths. He shouted for the town to pull back toward the lanes they had mapped in the crypt. "Give ground with purpose," he called. "Make them choose their mistakes." Rebellion was not only fire, it was geometry. The colonists folded into alleys and emerged behind wagons they had slotted there at dawn. Women tipped buckets of sand to smother sparks from the soldiers' granados. Boys darted through smoke with messages. Now, here, hold, turn. An old trapper lit a rope soaked in tallow and swung it across a powder cart. The fuse fizzed, then died. He smiled with 3 teeth and stamped the spark with his boot. "Not yet," he muttered. In the middle of it all, Sarah reached the gallows beam that had groaned night after night above the square. She wound Mary's torn ribbon around the post and tied it tight. Not a flag, a vow. Clark saw the knot and fired at it, as if killing a symbol could choke a people. The shot cut the edge of the cloth. The knot held. His face opened into something raw. Not grief. Rage that dignity refused to obey. Smoke thickened. The sun wilted to a ghost. Powder fouled, blades dulled. The struggle narrowed to breath and will. Farmers pressed shoulders to soldiers, and did not move when threatened. A grandmother struck the back of a captain's knee with a ladle, and laughed when he fell. Humiliation changed sides in a heartbeat, and then a revelation. From the northern lane, 3 figures in scarlet appeared, rifles at rest. They were redcoats, yet they did not raise their weapons. They pivoted and fired into the air, a signal crosswise to their own. Thomas recognized Wanoan, a quiet man who kept a psalm stitched into his cuff. He had chosen too. Betrayal. Turned its face toward justice and found a new name. Clark rallied what remained of his line and pulled them toward the churchyard wall. His voice cracked like a whip. "Form here?" The officers gathered, pale and panting. He scanned the square and found Father Cross standing near the altar, soot masking the white of his collar. Their eyes met. Clark lifted his pistol. Cross did not blink. Somewhere a hidden truth uncurled in both men. Some journeys bend the soul beyond return, one toward dominion, one toward deliverance. A gust shoveled the smoke aside long enough to reveal the ridge. Lanterns blinked, once, twice. Then the long pause that meant the road behind the garrison was blocked. Supplies stranded, retreat complicated. Independence no longer a rumor, but a set of choices forced upon an army that thought itself exempt from consequence. The town felt the shift, the way a field feels rain before it falls. The bell told a final time, not as an ending, but as a breath drawn. Deep before the next blow, bodies lay still. Names had been made in minutes that would weigh on generations. Hollow Creek stood bruised and unbroken. The fight had not finished. It had only found its shape. Somewhere beyond the houses, more boots gathered, more hooves pawed, more orders waited to be given and refused. The day leaned toward a darker hour, and the people of the town leaned with it, ready to pay the price no tyrant could calculate. The manor doors burst inward under a ram and a prayer. Wet boots slammed the marble. Powder smoke rolled down the corridor like weather gone wrong. Father Cross moved first, crucifix thudding against his chest with each step, cassock torn and dark with blood at the shoulder. His eyes were not wild. They were decided. "You burned the innocent under God's roof," he thundered into the hall, voice filling beams and portraits now burn in his sight. A redcoat lunged from behind a pillar. Cross fired once. The shot tore the man's throat and pinned him to the wainscot. Elias Boone came in behind, axe rising and falling with the certainty of a bell. Another soldier folded, scarlet spreading into the rug's gold. Clark backed toward the stair, pistol up, mouth twisted into a smile too tight to hold. He fired. The ball ripped the priest's shoulder. Cross staggered, dropped to a knee, then stood as if the wound belonged to another man. Blood ran. Resolve ran hotter. Elias roared and charged. A bayonet flashed. Elias took the blade on his forearm and brought the axe down. Wood splintered. Bone cracked. The stairwell filled with screams and orders that could not keep pace with fear. They swarmed Clark before he could reload. Jonathan Pike wrenched the pistol from his grip. Sarah Whitlow pressed a knife to his throat with a hand that did not tremble. "Her name," she said, voice like frost. "Say it." Clark's pale eyes flicked, not to her, but to the chandelier above, the window to the courtyard, every exit measured, every servant's door counted. He smiled again, thinner now. "Names are for subjects," he spat. "The king knows only numbers." Cross struck him then, not with rage, but with verdict. The butt of the spent musket slammed into the officer's jaw. Teeth snapped. Clark crumpled to his knees and spat pink. Runes spilled open under rough hands. Ledgers thumped onto tables. Letters fluttered from drawers. The truth of a tyranny lay written in neat columns and sealed crests. Inventories of grain seized for the comfort of gentlemen. Lists of exemplary punishments applied to late taxpayers. Orders for quartering that named widows first. A note in Clark's tight script. "The priest is a problem. Break him on conscience or break him on wood." Sarah read that line, then folded the paper and tucked it into her bodice as if it were a coal she meant to keep alive. In the kitchen, a scullery boy pointed at a locked door. Thomas Gray smashed it in with a poker. Inside, stacked crates marked for distant. Regiments held silk, silver, and rings wedding bands in a bowl like coins. Silence fell as the colonists stared at the stolen circles. Jonathan pushed his thumb through one band and felt its cold edge against the scar where rope had once burned his brother's skin. "They call us thieves," he said. "Look who keeps the loot." The hidden truth was no longer hidden. The shame belonged to the uniforms, not the fields. A shot cracked from the balcony. A redcoat who had feigned surrender fired down into the crowd. The ball struck Elias in the ribs. He went to one knee, breath torn from him. Sarah pivoted and flung her knife. It buried to the hilt in the shooter's chest. He folded over the rail and fell like a dropped oath. Cross reached Elias, pressed cloth hard against the wound. "Stay with me," he said, steady as an oath. Elias grinned through his teeth. "I've chased moose 3 days with a worse hole," he rasped. "Don't bury me before I swing at that baron's whelp again." Clark twisted, sudden as a snake, and drove his shoulder into Jonathan. The pistol skittered across the floor and vanished under a chaise. He dove for the servants' passage. Thomas went after him, boots hammering the narrow stairs, breath scalding his throat. The passage stank of lard and secrets. Clark slammed a door. Thomas smashed through, wood biting his shins. They spilled into a study lined with maps. Red pins marked towns like targets. Blue pins marked rivers like veins to be cut. For a heartbeat, the 2 men stared. the noble-born officer and the farm-boy soldier who had thrown down his allegiance. Choice crowded the room. Clark snatched a dress sword from the mantel. Thomas grabbed a poker. Steel met iron in a shower of sparks. Clark fought with trained wrists and a fury taught since the cradle. Thomas fought like a man who had learned every lesson the hard way and refused to fail the last one. He took a cut to the cheek, tasted copper, stepped in, and trapped the blade against the desk. "You were never brave," Thomas said through clenched teeth. "You were just protected." He twisted. The sword skittered. Clark struck him with a candlestick and ran for the window. Glass shattered. He tumbled into the rose garden, thorns raking his coat, and sprinted toward the stables. "Southgate!" Thomas shouted. Boots thundered behind him. In the courtyard, a patrol burst in, sabers out, faces gray with disbelief that this manor, built on other men's labor, could be pierced. Cross lifted a fallen flagpole like a spear and drove its tip into the lead rider's chest. The horse reared, screamed, crashed back into the fountain. Water and blood sprayed like an anointing turned to warning. Clark vaulted a trough, rammed a stable boy aside, and threw himself into a saddle. He spurred hard, eyes bright with escape. "Live long enough to watch your town burn," he hissed, as if the curse itself were a bayonet. Elias staggered into the yard, one hand pressed to his ribs, axe in the other. He swung as Clark raced past. The blade kissed the officer's thigh and opened it. Clark yelped, swayed, and clung on. He fled through the half-broken gate, leaving a ribbon of red that marked his route like a map. From the hill, lanterns flashed a warning. Two quick, one long reinforcements, drums like distant thunder. The Empire was not done. Inside the hall, Father Cross pressed a bandage to his shoulder and leaned on the table littered with stolen rings and damning letters. He felt the room tilt, then right itself under his palms. The humiliation of years had boiled into this hour, but the hour was not the end. Independence did not win itself in a single rush. It was forged in fire and sustained in patience. He looked at Sarah, at Thomas, at Jonathan, at the farmers and seamstresses and boys with soot on their cheeks. "We hold," he said, voice low and sure. "We bury our dead with honor. We send word to every farm and every church that the crown can be hurt. And we prepare. They will come angry. Let them." Elias coughed and laughed at once, a raw sound that still carried pride. "Let them find a town that learned to stand." The chandelier creaked in the draft like a gallows remembering its trade. Outside, hooves beat closer, a fist closing around a spark that had already leapt. Hollow Creek gathered its breath, gathered its wounded, gathered its proofs of betrayal. The journey had crossed a line. There would be a reckoning at the road where Clark's blood painted the mud. The storm on the horizon thickened, and the people straightened their backs to meet it, not as subjects, but as a people remade by sacrifice and bound by a single vow that no tyrant could silence. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. Clark did not run far. His trail was a red thread on wet stone, easy to follow, hard to forgive. They caught him in a thicket beyond the mill, dragged him through briars, and hauled him back over the ruts to the square where smoke still haunted the eaves. The cross leaned there like a memory that refused to rot. The air stank of soaked ash and old rum. Vengeance breathed with the rain. Father Cross stood before the timber, sleeve crusted with his own blood, eyes emptied of anything soft. "An eye for an eye," he said, voice low, not triumphant. It shook because he knew the weight of the words. Some battles were fought with powder, others with conscience. He had chosen his field. They bound Clark to the wood he had sanctified with cruelty. Rope cut, noble cloth. Oil ran down the grain and dripped onto the mud where Mary had cried out to heaven. Faces ringed the square farmers with jaws set, mothers with hands knotted at shawls, boys who had tasted gunsmoke and were too young for funerals. No shouts, no jeers, only breath, the kind that decides. Clark spat pink into the rain. His lip trembled, then steadied into scorn. "You think this makes you free?" he rasped. "You're slaves to your anger, subjects to flame." His pale eyes searched the crowd for a crack, a tremor. He found only the priest. Cross held his gaze and felt the old altar inside him crack. Mercy had been mocked as weakness. Patience had been traded for shame. He lifted the torch Thomas Gray pressed into his hand. It bobbed in the wind like a small mad star. "You burned the innocent under God's roof," Cross said. each word a stone set in a path. Now burn in his sight. He set the flame to the oiled wood. Fire licked, found purchase, and climbed. It wrote its letter. In orange on the damp air. Clark jerked against the bonds, teeth bared, then forced a grin that looked like a skull learning to laugh. There is no liberty in this, he coughed. Only ruin. The heat threw back at him the truth he had taught. Pain as policy, terror as law. He preached his last sermon to a people who had learned too much from his first. Sarah Whitlow did not look away. The glow washed her face and made her eyes into iron. Her name is Mary, she said, barely more than breath. Remember it. Jonathan Pike stood with his hammer hanging at his side, knuckles white, remembering a brother dangling from rope as gentlemen discussed wine. Elias Boone leaned on his axe, blood seeping through bandages, jaw set against both pain and pity. They were not feasting on suffering. They were measuring a price. Flames snapped and threw sparks into the rain. The square erupted not into cheers but into silence that felt like a verdict. The humiliation of years curled and turned to smoke. The priest tasted it and knew it would never wash out. To choose retribution is to be chosen by consequence. He did not flinch. He also did not celebrate. His mouth was a line carved into his face. Thomas Gray watched the man he had once saluted blacken against wood and felt neither triumph nor relief. Only a hard, steady confirmation. A world that breaks the innocent forfeits its right to comfort. He looked at Father Cross and saw a transformation he had not expected. The cassock had become a uniform, the crucifix, a standard. The man of peace had crossed a river that would not let him wade back. Rain kicked at the fire but could not smother it. Clark's voice fractured into curses, then into sound without words, then into nothing. When the ropes finally sagged, the cross held what was left of a dynasty's arrogance. Cross lowered the torch and stood beneath the heat he had commanded. He felt the hidden truth settle in his bones. Liberty devours illusions before it ever tastes bread. He had fed the flame with a life. Now he would be judged by what he built from the ash. A tremor went through the ground-distant drums, tight as fists. On the ridge, signals flashed. One, long. A column on the road. Reinforcements from the fort, or a column of militia answering whispered calls. The code left room for fear. Decisions spread across faces like dawn. Bury the dead? Hold the square? Break for the woods and force the fight into gullies where pride cannot march in a line? Every option cost something dear. Cross turned to his people. He saw Mother's slip rings back onto raw fingers scavenged from Clark's hoard. He saw a boy touch the rosary wrapped around the altar musket and make a sign in the air that was not a plea, but a vow. He saw merchants who had traded their neighbors for favor retreat into shadow, their eyes calculating new bargains. Betrayal would not stop today. It would learn new tricks. So would courage. Gather the wounded, Cross said, finally, voice roughened by smoke. No one is left for the crown. He pointed to 3 men. Cut down that timber. We do not honor their gallows. He nodded to Jonathan and Sarah. Sort the letters. Names. Orders. Every seal is a confession. He pressed a palm to his shoulder, to the slow seep of his own blood, and steadied himself against the pulpit that had watched him become someone else. Not a saint, not a judge, a leader who would pay. The first of the new riders crested the road. Blue coats? Red? The light made liars of colors. The town braced. Elias rolled his shoulders and grinned at Sarah without humor. If they're ours, we feed them, he muttered. If they're theirs, we starve them of comfort. Sarah tied Mary's ribbon tighter around her wrist. Jonathan lifted his hammer and felt his brother's palms settle, phantom warm, over his own. Cross looked once at the blackened cross, then up at the bell tower where Elias had defied despair, where hope had thundered like a warning. He breathed in. Smoke and rain and the metallic taste of a future not yet made. Independence was no banner. It was a journey through mire with a burden you choose to carry. He had chosen. So had they. Quote, the riders came on. Hooves struck sparks. Musket locks clicked like insects. The square narrowed to a point where a town's fate would hinge on courage and the ability to hold a line without pride. No prayers now. Only the stubbornness to finish what began at a woman's cry and a priest's vow and a people's refusal to kneel. Morning arrived thin and gray, laying its cold hand on the square. The cross was a stump of charcoal. Clark was a smear in the mud. Father Cross's piece lay beside them, a garment he would never wear again. He left at sunrise with a musket on his shoulder and scripture folded against his ribs. Not to flee, but to carry Hollow Creek's vow down every road the Empire pretended to own. The town watched him pass the old oak where Mary rested. 13 small flags trembled around her grave, like candles that refused to go out. Sarah pressed her forehead to the carved words, "Freedom is born in fire," and felt the world tip from prayer into purpose. They dug in. They laid the dead in good earth and spoke their names with dignity, not despair. Children brought stones to mark the mounds. Women salted meat and wound linen for bandages. Men oiled locks and checked flints, their hands steady as if mending harness. The humiliation that had kept eyes lowered had melted into something harder. To bow now would be betrayal. To hesitate would be surrendered by another name. Father Cross's path curved through farms and hollow roads. He stopped at mills where gears had been seized for levies, at chapels where officers had made altars into desks, at taverns where nobles bragged of punishments like hunters brag of pelts. At each place he told them a simple truth: the crown will not relent. You must decide. He did not ask for rage. He asked for transformation. He showed them a ring plucked from Clark's hoard, a wedding band that had waited in a bowl like a coin, and told them what it meant to be ruled by men who take even vows and melt them into spoils. Some spat, some wept, some fetched powder. By noon signals moved like migrating birds. A sheet pinned to a fence meant a safe house. A red thread in a window meant food for wounded. An extra nail in a gatepost meant patrols had changed. Old hunters taught boys to read sign as if the land itself kept minutes of the occupiers. March. Hidden truths surfaced from creek beds and hedgerows. There are paths no officer knows. There are hands that never show until the hour comes. The Empire answered with Polish. A baron's carriage rattled through the valley with silver crest bright as insult. Behind it marched a column of red and brass. Drums like heartbeats turned to law. A proclamation arrived with wax still warm. Taxes doubled, curfews fixed, amnesty for informers, rope for any who carried powder. Merchants who had smiled at redcoat tables hurried to align their ledgers with the new decrees. They spoke of order. They meant safety for themselves. The town took note. Names went into memory the way powder goes into a horn kept dry for the day it is needed. Night brought riders from 3 villages. They came quietly, faces wind-burned, hands scoured by winter. One carried a girl with a splinted arm. Another brought a sack of lead melted from church windows. They said the saints could spare a pain for liberty. Sarah met them at the door with broth and the last of her flour. She had burned her grief into fuel. Now she burned her pantry too. Sacrifice became a practice, not a moment. In the dark, plans multiplied. Sabotage, not spectacle. A bridge peg will loosen at the weight of a cannon. A boat will drift loose from its mooring on a moonless tide. A message will travel in the hem of a shawl stitched in small, ruthless letters. Decisions were hard. They were made. Jonathan took 6 men to shadow the supply. Rode and vanished into the pines. Elias, bound tight and pale, refused a bed. He sat on the church steps with his axe across his knees, a sentinel carved from stubbornness. Father Cross returned on the 3rd evening with 30 souls and a cart of salt pork, candles, and hymnals. He set the books on the altar as if laying down ammunition. "We will need songs as much as shot," he said. "They teach the mouth to hold courage." He bled through his bandage and did not hide it. The wound was his. "Uniform now." Thomas Gray read the officer's orders the priest had taken from the manor. A march, a raid, a plan to make an example of Hollow Creek at dawn in 2 days' time. The room listened like a clenched fist. Revelations rolled out of the paper like nails. The general whose seal glowed red had written of colonists as livestock. He had promised wealthy traders a share of seized land. He had recommended punishing seditious clergy with public degradation. Cross's jaw tightened, then eased. "They will come believing they know what we are," he said. "Let our answer be different than they measure." He sketched the town on a slate, marking lanes with chalk, wells with crosses, low stone fences with quick strokes. He placed the women where the powder would pass, the boys where messages would cut corners, the elders where fires must not take the roofs. He did not plan victory as a shout. He planned survival as a chain that would not break at the first pull. Sarah asked for a place. He gave her 3. At the oak with her sister. At the well where the wounded would find water. At the gallows stump, where she would tie Mary's ribbon for all to see. They will try to make us forget, she said. We will make forgetting impossible. Her voice did not rise. It settled like law. On the ridge, lanterns winked. 1, 2, the long pause. Allies in the hills had seen the column. The road from the fort carried more than boots. It carried hunger for punishment dressed as justice. Hollow, Crick answered, with bread sliced thin and knives honed thick. A child practiced loading a musket with corn kernels until his hands learned the dance. A grandmother murmured names into a bowl of flour, baptizing it with memory before kneading loaves for men who might not return. Before midnight, Cross walked to Mary's grave and set a small wooden cross at its foot, not to replace the words Sarah had cut, but to add his own. She chose compassion and taught us courage. Rain ticked on leaves. He spoke quietly to the ground as if it were a parishioner who needed truth more than comfort. We are out of petitions, he said. We are in the hour of answers. The wind pulled the smell of damp earth across the square. It smelled like fields before planting. It smelled like promise made of labor. At dawn's edge, the scouts came back, faces raw from cold and speed. The column had camped at the bend, artillery in tow. A noble with a blue sash rode at the front, eager to turn suffering into spectacle. He had brought a minister in lace to bless the punishment. Humiliation would be professional, not chaotic. That was their plan. Hollow Creek made its own. The bell rope waited. Powder waited. Decisions waited in the mouths of people who had run out of time to doubt themselves. Father Cross took his place not above them, but among them. He looked toward the bend where the road met the river, where the occupier would enter, believing himself a landlord collecting rent. The priest raised his hand, not for prayer, for silence, the kind that chooses its first word carefully because it knows history will carry the echo. The first drumbeat rolled across the fields. A hawk broke from the oak and cut the light with its wings. Sarah tied the ribbon tight. Elias lifted his axe. Jonathan's men shifted in the hedgerow. Children vanished behind doors that would open when the wounded needed hands. The town inhaled as one, braced against the weight that was coming, sure at last of what they were willing to pay and what they would never again permit. Dawn broke like a wound reopened. The valley smoldered with fog and the ghosts of battle yet to come. The air trembled with the low thunder of drums, each beat a reminder that liberty demanded payment in blood. Father Cross stood before the gathered townsfolk, his face streaked with ash, his eyes burning with the fierce calm of one who has seen both heaven and hell and chosen the harder road. He raised the tattered flag they had sewn. From the remnants of burned garments, crimson threads running like veins through the pale cloth. It was not perfect, but neither were they. It was human, and therefore sacred. The enemy marched closer, banners high, their polished boots blind to the mud they crushed. But Hollow Creek did not bow. The farmers who had once bent their backs for taxes now gripped muskets with calloused hands. Women tightened scarves and loaded powder. Even the children, who once played in silence beneath red banners, stood guard with slings and stones. The village that had suffered humiliation now carried itself with a dignity no empire could command. It was no longer a place. It was a vow made flesh. The first cannon echoed across the hills. Windows shattered. Birds burst from the trees. Cross did not flinch. "They think we are ashes," he said, his voice cutting through the roar. "But ashes remember fire." His words ran through the crowd like current through wire. Every man and woman felt it. The truth that rebellion was not destruction, but rebirth. To fight was not to hate, but to reclaim what had been stolen. The right to stand, to speak, to live without chains. When the redcoats advanced, they met not peasants, but a people transformed. Smoke rose from the rifles, from the hearts that refused surrender. The hills answered with defiance, each shot an act of faith, each fall a seed of endurance. Jonathan Pike fell beside the old well, his hand still clutching the hammer that had built, as much as it had broken. Sarah Whitlow dragged him to cover and kept firing, her sister's ribbon tied around her arm like an oath. Elias Boone, bleeding anew, laughed between volleys. "This is our reckoning," he shouted, "not theirs." And beside him the priest lifted his crucifix as if it were both shield and sword. Hours bled into one another until the smoke became a sky of its own. The enemy faltered, not from fear, but from realization. No power could conquer a soul that had already decided to die free. When the dust cleared, Hollow Creek still stood, ruined, scarred, but unbroken. The cost was carved into the ground, but so was the beginning of something immortal. From those ashes, the whisper of liberty spread like rumor and like prophecy. Villagers heard it, then towns, then colonies. A priest's defiance, a widow's courage, a farmer's hand, all bound together in one shared revelation. Freedom is not granted, it is claimed. That night, the stars returned. Father Cross knelt beside Mary's grave and laid the bloodied flag upon the soil. "We have earned the right to remember," he murmured, "and we will not forget." The others gathered, silent, their faces lit by the glow of the fires still burning at the edges of the field. It was not mourning, it was vigilance, the eternal watch of those who know liberty is never safe, only kept alive. And so Hollow Creek became more than a place on a map. It became the echo that stirred nations, the spark carried in every heart that refuses submission. The cross that once stood for death now marked resurrection. The flame that once destroyed now lit the road toward independence. If this story found its way into your heart, let it remind you that freedom is not born in comfort, but in struggle. That the dignity of a people lies not in their obedience, but in their will to rise again. Support these stories of courage and sacrifice, our shared memory of what it costs to be free. Comment below. The flame of freedom burns in me. And, when you're ready, here is another story of courage and sacrifice. Click and continue with me.